To begin, I would like to express my deep gratitude for the honor of this invitation to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you. I will try to keep my remarks from extending too long so that there will be time for debate afterwards, for question and answer comments, as you would all like. I was extremely flattered by the generous introduction. I assure you I don't walk on water. It's, but it is true that I have been in this business a very long time, and it is my 50th year as an academic. I like to think that it's an accomplishment, for better or for worse. Today, I would like to talk about the coming global monetary disorder. That is not a prediction. I don't have in mind an absolute prediction. But my question is, what is the outlook for the international monetary system, for international monetary relations? My answer is that more disorder is the most likely scenario. It is the scenario with the highest probability. And the reason I think that is because I seem to see a growing sense of complacency in the financial markets and in our governmental institutions, central banks and treasuries and finance ministries in the major countries. There seems to be a growing sense of complacency that the worst is over and that things are getting better. I feel that there is reason to believe that that complacency is misguided, both because I think it overestimates how much recovery has occurred around the world, and secondly, it underestimates some key risks that we should be worried about. I'm going to suggest at the end two relatively obvious policies that we might try to follow. One would be to strengthen the commitment to growth, and the second would be to promote greater policy cooperation. In principle, these would be desirable, but I'm not sure that we can do it. We'll see. Now, I start with a caveat, with a qualification. Not everybody is complacent. In particular, we're finding from the International Monetary Fund some serious warnings about the problems that we still face. Christine Lagarde warns about deceiving calm. The Economist warns us that we still are facing testing times. But there are, it seems to me, very widespread signs of growing complacency. We're seeing a flow of capital back into advanced economies, including Spain and other economies that have been part of the crisis in the Eurozone over recent years. A reflow of capital is not a bad thing, but the margins, once again, the interest rates and the margins are becoming very narrow, a sign of growing confidence, if not complacency. We've seen Ireland and just yesterday Portugal officially exiting from their rescue packages, and they have foregone the possibility of a safety net. That may be a good idea, but I doubt it. We're seeing central banks pulling back or standing pat on their monetary policies. The U.S. Federal Reserve is tapering its quantitative easing program down by the fall. It will be terminated. The European Central Bank is expected to loosen up a bit at its next meeting, but not by much, and many people would argue not by enough. There is good news, of course. This table that you see on the screen is a summary of the projections in the latest World Economic Outlook of the International Monetary Fund. And you can see that the figure for world growth is expected to rise from 3.0 in 2013 to 3.6 this year, and to 3.9 next year. That would seem to be good. And there are some positive projections for the United States and for the countries of the Euro area as well. There seems to be some evidence in these forecasts of recovery from the crisis that we've been laboring under since 2008. But there's also a lot of bad news, it seems to me. that requires us to be very cautious. For one thing, it's clear that the growth projections that have been put out by the International Monetary Fund, it seems to me one could argue about their optimism. The projection for France, for example, is for considerable recovery this year from 0.3% to 1.0%, yet the latest number from France for the first quarter was 0. That's not very promising. Italy was actually negative. The Eurozone growth was actually just half of what the IMF had projected. Eastern Europe could be very badly hit by the events going on in the Ukraine. China, which is projected to have a growth rate slightly lower this year and again next year, China actually could be declining rather more rapidly than those numbers suggest. There's a good deal of evidence in China that things are slowing down very rapidly. For example, the producer price index in China has declined for 26 straight months, an indication of declining orders. The commodity exporters are all experiencing significant slowdown because of the slowdown in China and therefore the slowdown of demand for commodities in China. We have a long history of, throughout this crisis since 2008, an unfortunate history of official projections that say, well, this year things are not going to be so good, but next year things are going to be better. And then a year later, they say, well, things aren't so good this year, but they'll be better next year. And this has gone on now each year. And so a certain note of skepticism seems to be warranted. But even if these projections are not too optimistic, they're hardly impressive. They're still quite weak. Global GDP growth rate is at least 2 percentage points below historical average, and that makes a big difference given the power of compounding over time. Makes a big difference. GDP in all of the advanced economies, except Germany and the United States, is still, gross domestic product is still below where it was 6 years ago at the beginning of the crisis. And that, of course, is obviously true for Spain, among others. Unemployment is extraordinarily high, 26 million in Europe, 14 million in the United States, 62 million worldwide. Those are terrible numbers. Those are human beings, 62 million human beings unable to find work. And there's a very serious risk of deflation. If we look at the inflation numbers, they are very low. In the Eurozone, 0.5% currently. Some people are calling this lowflation. To give a simple example, Olivier Blanchard, the chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, says that there is a 25% chance that there will be absolute deflation in Europe by the end of this year. The risk of a repetition in Europe of what happened to Japan since the bursting of the bubble economy in 1989, the risk is high. We have to be aware of that. Case in point is Spain. I mean, your economy has suffered greatly. I don't have to tell you that. That's not news to you. But I find it really quite surprising that with a 26% unemployment rate, and with a GDP growth rate which is barely positive, and with a GDP level which is below that of 6 years ago, that your prime minister can say he can boast that Spain has a rebuilt economy. It seems to me that it's still a long way to go in that respect. But what I want to emphasize most today are the most important risks that I see in the international monetary system that are currently not receiving the attention that they should. 3 very significant risks that are underestimated in the financial markets and in government actions, not words but actions. I list them here. First, the risk of exchange rate instability and conflict, what's referred to as currency wars. Secondly, the risk of instability that can come from the competition of the top international currencies, the dollar and others, which could result in a crisis of the dollar. And thirdly, the erosion of monetary cooperation, the erosion of governance in the international monetary system. I will try to say a few words about each of these three. I will try not to spend too much time so that we can maximize time for discussion. Let me start with currency wars. The term currency war was first coined back in the 1930s, when it was obvious to everyone that governments were competing with one another to devalue their currencies in order to gain advantage, competitive advantage in world export markets at the expense of others. These became known as beggar thy neighbor policies. And the number of competitive devaluations during the 1930s was something like 28 or 30. Several countries devalued several times in response to the devaluations of others. In principle, this kind of behavior was supposed to be outlawed by the Bretton Woods Agreement, the agreement that established the International Monetary Fund and the post-war Bretton Woods system. In principle, these were to be outlawed. Every government was to maintain a fixed exchange rate. That, of course, that system broke down in the beginning of the 1970s, and all the major currencies and a lot of other currencies began to float to a greater or lesser extent. Because of that, it was necessary to reform or amend the Articles of Agreement of the International Monetary Fund, specifically Article 4, which deals with exchange rates, in order to try to introduce some rules that would prevent a recurrence of the kind of currency wars that had occurred in the 1930s. Under the IMF Article 4, countries are allowed to do what they want with their exchange rate, anything from a hard peg to a soft peg to a managed float to a free float, but they were forbidden, governments are forbidden, in principle, forbidden to manipulate their exchange rate, quote unquote, to gain unfair competitive advantage. And to try to prevent that kind of behavior, the IMF was given the power to exercise, quote unquote, firm surveillance over the exchange rate policies of governments. And to do this, the IMF has developed the practice of an annual consultation. It's called an Article 4 consultation. And it's developed a series of criteria by which to judge whether or not a country is, in fact, attempting to manipulate its exchange rate. The problem is it just hasn't worked very well. Surveillance has been very ineffective. Governments basically do what they want. They can intervene directly in the foreign exchange market, or they can manipulate the exchange rate indirectly through domestic monetary policy, or increasingly through capital controls. Once again, capital controls are coming into fashion. We might ask, why is IMF surveillance so ineffective? There are two reasons, I would argue, two reasons. One has to do with the difficulty of assessing government motivation, and the other has to do with the demands of political sovereignty. First, on motivation. We can see government policy here, and we can see exchange rate change over here. The question is the exchange rate change the direct objective of the policy over here, or is it an incidental byproduct? One can't always be sure. Many policies that are taken for purely domestic reasons can have the consequence of moving the exchange rate, but whether that was the purpose of the policy is much more difficult to determine. To give an example, the Federal Reserve, as you know, in the United States, started a program of quantitative expansion, actually the second such program, in 2010. It was called QE2, like the ship, Queen Elizabeth II, QE2. It was obvious that the Federal Reserve was doing this primarily for domestic reasons, to try to bring down interest rates, to try to increase the reserve base of banks, and enable the system to increase lending to help the recovery from the recession of 2008, 2009. But of course, as any economist, anyone who's had a basic principles course of macroeconomics knows, If you have a reduction of interest rates, there's likely to be some outflow of capital in search of higher returns elsewhere, and that will tend to push down the exchange rate. Is that change of the exchange rate, the depreciation of the dollar that resulted from QE2, the question is, was that the objective of policy or was it the incidental byproduct? The finance minister of Brazil revived the term currency war, saying that this was in fact the deliberate manipulation of the exchange rate by the United States to gain unfair competitive advantage in world markets. The U.S., on the other hand, the Federal Reserve said, no, this was not our purpose. Our purpose was to stimulate the domestic economy, as I said, through lower interest rates and more liquidity. The irony of all this, of course, was last year, May of last year, just a year ago, when Ben Bernanke, when he was still chair of the Federal Reserve, announced that there would soon be a tapering of the QE2. Immediately, money started to flow back to the United States. Exchange rates started to go the other way. And the finance minister of Brazil once again said, this is currency war. It was currency war whether it went up or whether it went down. One could argue that this was more a sense of frustration on the part of the Brazilian authorities, not a real evidence of currency manipulation. Or one could look at the case of Japan, where when the Prime Minister, Mr. Abe, came into power just over a year ago, he instituted his new set of policies that became known as Abenomics, one of which was a big expansion of monetary policy, a very big monetary stimulus. The Japanese claim that this is for the purpose of raising inflationary expectations to get the country out of deflation that it suffered from for so long. But many others suspect that actually might have been intended to depreciate the yen in order to gain an advantage in world markets for Japanese exports. The yen did decline, then went back up again. Or we could look at the East Asian countries, China in particular, but also some others, who clearly have been intervening directly in the foreign exchange market to manage their exchange rates and accumulate enormous amounts of reserves in the process. Was that accumulation of reserves for the purpose of self-insurance, to provide ammunition in the case of another crisis like that of 1997-98? Or was this to keep their exchange rates low, to maintain competitive advantage? Again, it's not easy to make these kinds of judgments. And then, of course, even apart from that difficulty of identifying motivations, is the fact that the IMF, even if it could identify motivations without question, with clarity, the problem with the IMF is that it's a multinational organization without supranational power. State sovereignty still rules. The IMF does not have the authority to go and tell a country, you must change your policies, not unless it's borrowing and in deep trouble and borrowing from the IMF, and the IMF can set conditions. But for China or for many other countries, the IMF, unless these countries are in need of funds from the IMF, as some of the European countries have, the IMF has no enforcement power. The result, therefore, in my view, is that there really is a danger of increased manipulation of exchange rates, a real danger of renewed currency war. And one reason I believe that's the case is simply because the recovery has been so sluggish. The recovery since the crisis has really been poor, as I suggested a few minutes ago. Unemployment rates remain high. Governments are under pressure, including your own, to do more. The European parliamentary election that's coming up next week is expected to bring a major vote for protest parties that have been protesting all of the austerity measures that have been imposed. Governments like that of Spain and other countries in Europe are under great pressure to recover their economies, and one obvious way to try to do that is by lowering your exchange rate, by forcing down your exchange rate. As long as the recovery remains sluggish, governments will have this temptation in front of them. And that in turn will have the potential for retarding recovery, simply because if more and more countries are doing this, and there really is an outbreak of open currency war, this will inhibit adjustment to imbalances, will increase volatility and uncertainty, and that will be a bad thing from the point of view of economic recovery. But of course, if you disagree with me, I'll be happy to hear your comments. Now, the second of the three risks that I wanted to emphasize, I put here dollar crisis, primarily because the dollar has been, as you all well know, has been the dominant currency in the international monetary system ever since the 1930s. The dollar, for much of the period since World War II, has been effectively a monopoly. There are other currencies that have roles as international money, but the only currency that is used for all monetary roles and across the globe is the US dollar. Any challenge to the dollar could take the form of what we would call a dollar crisis. There's a lot of debate about whether the dominance of the US dollar is a good thing or a bad thing. And if anyone wants to ask about that later, I could go into more detail. Essentially, on the one side is the argument that the U.S. plays the role of a stabilizing hegemon, dominant power. And one piece of evidence would be, for example, the swap arrangements that the Federal Reserve created when the crisis broke in 2008 in order to provide liquidity to a variety of other countries. But on the other hand, there are those who would argue that the U.S. abuses its monopoly power, what's called the exorbitant privilege. That was a term first invented by Giscard d'Estaing when he was finance minister for Charles de Gaulle. My answer to this debate is sort of like the old story. There's an old story in my ethnic tradition about a rabbi in a small town where people would bring their disputes for settlement. And the rabbi was sitting, and one of the two people in the dispute gave his side of the story, and the rabbi said, "You're right." And the other person said, wait a minute, you haven't heard my side of the story. He gives his side of the story, and the rabbi says, "You're right." And the rabbi's disciples look at him, and they say, "Well, they can't both be right, can they?" And the rabbi says, "You're right." The fact is that there's truth on both sides of this debate. I personally believe that the U.S. role has been more positive than negative, but some of you may disagree, and I certainly would be prepared to hear your point of view. Because of so much feeling that the U.S. has abused its privilege, there is a great feeling around the world that we should move toward a more multipolar currency system. We should promote the role of alternatives to the dollar. The argument being that this would impose a discipline on the United States because people would now have an alternative and would not be in the hands of a monopoly. I frankly find this to be a very widely held view. Particularly in East Asia, where I've been a number of times recently, and the belief is very firm that we need to have a multipolar currency system. But there is a counter argument that the more currencies there are, the more dominant, the more major currencies there are, the more risk of competition between them, where each of the issuers would try to take advantage of the exorbitant privilege. There could be a lot of destabilizing shifts of confidence among the currencies, and so on. Again, I think the answer is that there's some truth on both sides. And I personally think that a multi-currency system would be less stable than a one-currency system. But again, that's subject to debate. Sincere people can sincerely disagree on issues of this kind. The real question is whether there are any serious competitors to the dollar, whether there is, in fact, the possibility of the emergence of new currencies which could compete with the dollar and therefore run the risk of creating greater instability. I think most of us would agree that there are really, at the moment, only two possible contenders. One is the euro, and the other is the Chinese currency, the Yuan or renminbi, the RMB. My answer with both, as you can see here on the screen, is no, but. That is to say, no, I do not think that these currencies pose a serious threat to the global dominance of the dollar. And I don't say that out of patriotic fervor. I think that that's a reasonable analysis. But the but part is I do expect each of them to compete with the dollar on a regional level. The euro in Europe and around the Mediterranean, the yuan in East Asia. And this can create considerable opportunity for instability. A few words about each of those. First, the euro. I think it's evident that the euro has not lived up to the expectations of many people when the euro came into existence, starting in 1999. At that time, it was expected that the euro could pose a real threat to the dominance of the dollar. In fact, there were some people who were predicting that the euro would surpass the dollar in a relatively short time. Two American economists, Menzies Chin and Jeffrey Frankel. Jeffrey Frankel is at Harvard and a former member of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. They made a confident prediction in 2008 that the euro would surpass the dollar as an international currency by the year 2015. Anyone want to take a bet on that? Clearly, that's not going to happen. It hasn't happened. The reality is that for all of the strengths that the euro had at the time of its creation, the euro has not come anywhere near to challenging the dollar on the global level, although it is clearly the number 2 currency in the world. If you look at data on the currency composition of reserves, or the international bond market, or the foreign exchange market, in each of these, the euro maintains a strong second-place position, smaller only than that of the dollar. But the euro, most of the gain in international use of the euro occurred in its first half-decade. By 2004, things leveled off. Its share of reserves failed to rise after 2004, and in other sectors as well. Use of the euro stabilized at about a level comparable to that of the legacy currencies. And there has even been, during these years of crisis starting in 2010, there has even been some decline in the share of the euro in major segments. The problem, it's now quite clear, the problem is in the structure of governance of the Eurozone, which has many flaws and, among other things, creates a serious anti-growth bias. That's my opinion, an anti-growth bias. The biggest problem is the lack of any kind of credible mechanism to deal with imbalances within the group, the sort of thing that you've had to live through since the beginning of the crisis here in Europe. The fact that some countries, like Germany, have strong balance of payments surpluses, and others have serious deficits, and there is no mechanism for dealing with that. In the United States, over a long period of time, a system was developed to deal with those kinds of internal imbalances. We have a system of 50 states and one currency, but we don't have serious crises because of imbalances within the group, primarily because a system has developed in the United States that encompasses these 3 characteristics. Balanced budgets at the state level, not always realized, but there is an obligation to go for balanced budgets. There is a bailout ban. The federal government does not bail out individual states. And most importantly, there is a system of automatic transfers, automatic depoliticized transfers from from states that are doing well. Money flows into Washington, extra tax payments and the like, and then flows from Washington to the states that are doing less well. It's a system of automatic transfers. It can be understood as a mutualization of risk, a sharing of risk. States at some points may be in surplus and contribute, at other times may be recipients. Because this is automatic, it's below the radar screen. People in the United States are not even aware of it. We in California, people in California are not aware of the fact that our tax revenues go to Washington and then go to poorer states like West Virginia. Nobody worries about that. Nobody complains about that. This would be the ideal solution for Europe, but of course, it hasn't been done. And it hasn't been done primarily because of the fact that this is not a federal system like that of the United States. This is not a United States of Europe. It's more like the Articles of Confederation stage of American history, the period between the Revolution and the signing of the Constitution in 1789. You know, when you get to be my age, the centuries all start to blur together. You know. The European quote-unquote solution involved the Stability and Growth Pact to try to limit deficits at the state level, and a ban on bailouts, but it didn't work. We no longer have a ban on bailouts because now there is a formal European stability mechanism, and the fiscal compact has succeeded the Stability and Growth Pact, but there are severe doubts about the effectiveness of the fiscal compact. Already when countries have received waivers on their fiscal policy targets and the like. One economist has described the fiscal compact as the Stability and Growth Pact with lipstick, just a bit of cosmetics. The reality is that Europe has not taken the step that is really necessary, which is to provide for automatic transfers. That has not happened, and my guess is that it will not happen. And as long as it does not happen, there will be what I call an anti-growth bias. Why? Because when there are no automatic transfers between surplus and deficit countries within the group, then every crisis, every imbalance must be negotiated. And when it's negotiated, the creditors always have the upper hand. Creditors always have the advantage. I have a quotation from John Maynard Keynes, but I can't find it at the moment. Yeah, there it is. John Maynard Keynes, when he was writing about the classical gold standard, he said, "The process of adjustment is compulsory for the debtor and voluntary for the creditor." Now that should ring very true to all of you. You have been the debtor country and you have been required, it's been an obligation to adjust. The surplus countries like Germany, if they contribute anything at all, it's strictly voluntary. Oh, there's the, I should have read it right off the screen. Worse than that is the fact that when debtor countries are obligated to adjust, they have very few choices. Again, something that should be very familiar to you. You can't use monetary policy. European Central Bank makes monetary policy. You can't change your exchange rate. You're part of a common currency. You can't use capital controls. You're part of a common currency. You can't use trade controls. You're part of the EU. What's left? Internal devaluation, otherwise known as austerity. And that creates an anti-growth bias because there's no growth stimulus in the surplus countries, but there's growth reduction in the deficit countries. In 1896, William Jennings Bryan, an opponent of the gold standard, in his acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention accepting the nomination for president, I'm sure you know he was not elected president, he said, "We shall not be crucified on a cross of gold." But what the Eurozone has succeeded in doing is recreating a gold standard without gold at the regional level, a cross of euros. And I fear that that's what you have to live with right now. Is the euro doomed? A couple of years ago, many people were really convinced that the euro could break up, that the Eurozone would fall apart. I had debates with American colleagues at the time. I said, no, that's not going to happen. I said the answer is not that the euro will fail, but that the euro will neither fail nor succeed. It will not fail You may or may not agree with me, but the sense I have from across the ocean, in fact, across the ocean and across a continent, 9 time zones, the impression I have is that there is a deep, deep commitment to keeping the euro alive, if for no other reason, in order to avoid the chaos that would come with a breakup of the eurozone. But on the other hand, there is no commitment to the kind of solution that would be required to really make the eurozone operate effectively. So the result is neither failure nor success, but rather an uneasy, untidy series of compromises of the sort that we keep seeing, most recently in the construction of a banking resolution mechanism that is, it's very difficult to imagine will ever work satisfactorily. My conclusion then is that for all these reasons, the euro is not likely to challenge the dollar as a global currency. But there's no question that the euro is number 2 in the world, that within the neighborhood of the European Union, the euro is the most attractive currency because most business is done by neighboring countries with the European Union. It makes sense to favor the euro. But beyond the European neighborhood, the countries that are in the European region, or as the European Central Bank sometimes says, in the European time zone, because it extends down into Africa, in this area, there is a potential for competition and therefore for destabilizing volatility. What about the yuan? I'm sure that you're aware of the fact that many people feel that the yuan, the RMB, or renminbi, people's currency, many people are of the opinion that it's only a matter of time before the RMB becomes the dominant international currency. Just as Menzies Chin and Jeffrey Frankel were predicting that the euro within a certain period of time would surpass the dollar, so more recently we've had people like Arvind Subramanian of the Peterson Institute in Washington confidently predicting that the yuan will surpass the dollar before the end of this decade. I am a skeptic on that. I don't believe that's going to be the case. It's clear that China has adopted a strategy designed to achieve internationalization, a major international role for the RMB. It's a strategy that consists of 2 tracks, on a trade track promoting the use of the currency for trade purposes. They've signed a series of almost 24 swap agreements with countries to promote the use of the yuan. They now allow all of Chinese trade to be denominated in yuan, and I think the percentage is up to about 16% now. And on the finance side, they've been promoting a market for bank deposits in yuan, yuan-denominated bonds, all in Hong Kong, so-called dim sum bonds. I would argue that the strategy is actually well conceived. In some work that I've done recently, I've disaggregated the roles of an international currency. One could argue that there are 6 individual roles of an international currency, reflecting the 3 roles of money: medium of exchange, unit of account, store of value, at 2 levels of operation, at the level of the market and at the level of governments. Makes for a matrix of 6 possible roles. And I find that the roles that are most important in terms of economic or political advantage, the roles that are most important are as a trade, a currency, that is a currency to invoice and settle trade, as a currency of denomination in international financial markets, and as a reserve currency. Those are the 3 most important roles, and those are exactly the roles that are being promoted by the 2-track strategy that China has developed. So in that sense, I would argue that the Chinese strategy is well conceived. But the choice of means to achieve those goals, one could argue, is not well conceived, because until now, China has relied primarily on what some refer to as its gravitational pull. In other words, simply its huge size and its huge importance as a trading nation. China is the number 1 export market for more than 60 countries around the world. China is relying on that as an incentive and a stimulus to adoption of the yuan. But if we learn anything from the history of international currency, both those like sterling or the dollar that have risen to global dominance, and those like the Deutschmark or the yen that looked as if they might but then did not, we learn that it takes more than just large size and large volume of international trade. It takes more than these network externalities that people talk about to achieve a truly global role for a currency. One must have very well-developed financial markets that are open to foreigners. One must have a respect for the rule of law and enforcement of contracts and property rights. And China is way behind, as you all know, I'm sure, way behind in offering these advantages to foreigners. And as long as China does remain behind in these areas, its statecraft will be ineffective, even though its strategy is well conceived, again, in my opinion. I personally don't expect China to meet the needs of a well-developed financial market, an open capital account, respect for the rule of law. I don't expect to see these for a long time because they are really inconsistent with the political economy model that has brought such success to China up to this point, the so-called Beijing Consensus, which combines an autocratic state with reliance on market mechanisms. The Chinese government has used its control of its own financial markets as a central part of its guidance of the economy through control of interest rates, through allocation of credit, through closing of the capital account and fixing the exchange rate. All of these would have to be given up. And it's very hard to imagine that the Chinese government is going to give them up under current circumstances. So my conclusion here too is that, like the euro, the currency is unlikely to become a major rival to the dollar at the global level. But once again, it will certainly have enough attractiveness to become a rival at the regional level, and that again could raise the risk of instability. Finally, on the third of the three risks that I wanted to talk about, namely governance, in order to deal with problems like the risk of currency war or the risk of a dollar crisis, in order to deal with these, there has to be some form of governance, by which we mean the setting of rules, the implementation of rules, the enforcement of rules. At the national level, of course, we have formal government to do that, to practice governance. At the international level, we don't have formal government to exercise governance, to make the rules and enforce the rules. What we require, therefore, is cooperation among sovereign governments. We need more cooperation. But among the many lessons of political economy history is that that kind of governance is, that kind of cooperation is very difficult to achieve without these two ideas that I put up here. One is that there must be some consensus on basic principles. There must be some basic agreement on what the problems are and how to deal with them. And secondly, there has to be effective leadership. Cooperation does not occur spontaneously, except possibly in very serious crisis circumstances. For the most part, cooperation has to be cultivated. There must be leadership to organize cooperation. And neither of these is in much evidence today. If I look at the International Monetary Fund, an attempt was made with the reform agreed in 2010, but there's a real risk that reform will never come into existence. Why? Well, this is where I have to say, on behalf of 315 million Americans, mea culpa. We, the United States, are the problem here because the Congress has refused to ratify this and the United States has a veto over these matters. This is a very sad story. The President has repeatedly submitted the IMF reform and it has been rebuffed time and time again. Most recently in the legislation authorizing sanctions on Russia over the events in the Crimea. The result is that The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and other emerging market economies, are saying that if the U.S. doesn't ratify this by the end of this calendar year, that they will urge the IMF to go on alone without the United States, in effect, break up the IMF. And that clearly would be to the serious detriment of the international monetary system. Many people were putting hope in the group of 20. Immediately after World War II, there was one dominant power, the United States. Then gradually, as the post-war recoveries took place, that was expanded to the group of 7. When the group of 7 was created in the 1970s, it accounted for half of the world economy. But of course, that share has declined over time, so when the new crisis began in 2008, it was decided that responsibility should be shifted from the group of 7 to the group of 20. Here's a question for you. How many countries are there in the group of 20? Anybody know how many countries there are in the group of 20? This is not a trick question. You would think 20, but one of the 20 countries is the European Union. One of the 20 members is the European Union. The European Union has 28 members, right? 28 members, okay? But 4 of the 28 members are represented separately: Britain, France, Italy, and Spain. So what does that mean? So we have 19 plus 28 less 4. That comes out to 43 countries, if I'm not mistaken. And these 43 countries represent 85% of the world economy. So there was great hope that if the group of 20 could exercise effective leadership, governance would be effective. Unfortunately, however, the group of 20 has been a failure, an absolute failure. In 2008, there was an agreement that everybody would undertake fiscal stimulus. That's not really cooperation. They were all scared, frightened by the risk of a return to Great Depression. It was in their interest, everyone, to do this. This was not cooperation. This is what in the technical language is known as harmony, that everybody doing what was in their interest would serve the common interest as well. But since that time, there have been great differences, and the result is that the summit meetings of the group of 20 end up as photo opportunities with meaningless communiques. There are very few accomplishments, and the reasons are clear. There is no consensus on basic principles, and there is no effective leadership because of the diffusion of power that has occurred within the group. And the result, therefore, is drift and the rising risk of political conflict. So, to conclude, before you all fall asleep, if you believe even half of what I've said, and you're not obligated to, of course, but if you believe even half of what I said, then you can see that there is good reason to avoid being complacent. Not only do I feel that the improvements have been overestimated, we've come to lower our expectations so much that an economy of 26% unemployment can be claimed to be rebuilt. That's a lowering of expectations. But more importantly, because the risks have been underestimated, these risks that I've referred to. And so I do believe that there is an important risk of growing monetary disorder. What can we do? Well, at the level of general principle, it's obvious what we need to do is to strengthen our commitment to growth, to restore more growth-oriented policies rather than anti-growth policies. And secondly, to encourage more policy coordination by trying to reach agreement on basic principles and so on. But it's obvious that that's easier said than done. The politics of the world economy are such that it's very unlikely that governments will easily achieve these objectives. And so we have in the United States the scouting movement for young boys, and the motto of the Scouts is "Be prepared," and that's what I'm suggesting we need to be in the future of the international monetary system. Be prepared. So thank you very much for your attention.